Hello, I'm Carolyn Morrison with Children's Administration, Department of Social and Health Services, and welcome to yet another workshop for foster parents and for parents in general who are interested in studying about and learning about children and trauma. How many of us can say that our lives are the same after the events of September the 11th? Many of us are having trouble sleeping. A lot of us are having to work a lot harder at feeling optimistic about the future. A great many of us startle a little bit more when we hear a loud noise. And I can tell you, as one of many people at the Mariners game last Sunday, our eyes were constantly scanning the skies around Seattle. And so, if it's like that for us, what must it be like for the children in our midst? Children who perhaps before September 11th had some rather difficult circumstances to deal with. So today our topic is how to deal with children who are traumatized. What can we do as adults in their lives to help them through this difficult time and to hopefully give them some tools to handle this situation and other traumas that they may encounter in the future. We're joined today by a very distinguished panel who have agreed to share their thoughts and experiences with us. We have Ross Dawson, who is the Assistant Deputy Secretary for the Department of Social and Health Services Children's Administration. We have Dr. Harry Creamer, who is the Director of Kittitas Services for the Central Washington Comprehensive Mental Health in Ellensburg. And we have Mrs. Julie Gilo, who is a very seasoned foster parent who has 7 children in her home. And so I'm going to ask Julie to kind of put a human face for us today on what she's seeing with her children since September 11th. Julie, could you share with us what you're seeing with your lovely children?
Thanks, Carolyn. My husband and I are licensed foster parents. We live over on the west side of the mountains, over north of Seattle. And as Carolyn was saying, we have 11 children in our home. Depending upon the age of the child, depending upon their verbal ability, their verbal processing speeds, where they are, in their own separation and loss issues, we've had a great variety of reactions and symptoms. And I don't think that our home is a lot different than, any other type of home at this point. Some of our kids, actually, my one daughter in particular, who is 9, and have lived with us actually for 8 years already. So we have, a very good foundation as far as attachment and bonding. And yet Tessa has been showing a lot of difficulty with sleeping. And this was a symptom that she had when she first came to live with us, was a lot of sleep disturbances. And we're seeing that again. Oftentimes awake, sometimes 10, 12 times a night. She's much easier to redirect at this point than she was years ago. But, she will come into the bedroom sometimes 10, 12 times a night just to check, Mom, Dad, are you here? Those kinds of things. And I'm hearing a lot from her. She's a very verbal child and probably one of the best of my kids as far as abilities to communicate. But she's the one who's talking a lot about, so do we still have to worry about airplanes crashing into buildings? Why did people hate us that much that they would do this to us? And I've seen different kinds of reactions from her, like, well, some people say we should really go to war and we should, just bomb those cities. And then, but on the other hand, she'll say, but then we're hating them too. So, she has some movement back and forth, and she wants to talk about it. The issues with Tessa, though, a lot are like the sleep disturbances, and she gets stuck. It's like she'll see a newscast. She's the one that wants to watch the news with Dad, but then she can't get off the topic. She's very, almost like hyper-vigilant about that, wanting to know where I'm going to be. Where are you going today, Mom? What time are you going to be home? So even though she's the most verbal of my kids, she's also one that's manifesting a lot of those kinds of behaviors. Then we have, her brother Michael, biological brother actually, who's 12, and Michael's response was, he came home from school the day of the terrorist attack, snuck down into the TV room to watch television because he knows that's not what we do after school. And within 2-3 minutes, he's coming down the hallway, and he is very upset that this is on every channel on TV, doggone it. And his response to me was, hey, I don't get this, Mom. Why are we still watching it? It happened 3 hours ago. So for Michael, he almost has these built-in protective factors of, let's get on with life now. This is, done. But it's two huge ends of the spectrum that I have just in those two kids. So Michael wants to be outside playing basketball, going to Special Olympics, doing all those things. Tessa wants to be watching the news, and she's worried about anthrax and smallpox, So it's a big difference. And then, like our oldest son, who's 17, Theodore truly has a verbal processing disability. I mean, his verbal IQ is 55. And yet, when I watched him in the last, 3 weeks, he's watching the news. You can tell that things are going through his mind. And yet, when we try and say, so, Theodore, how's this making you feel? What's going on? He can't get those responses out. So I feel stuck kind of with him, And then my youngest son, who just amazes me sometimes, but Brandon has full-blown fetal alcohol syndrome. He's been with us since birth. The doctors told us he wouldn't live, to be a year old, and that he would be so impaired. And yet he's now 6. And, he's showing some anxiety, like, you're not flying anywhere today, are you, Mom? And yet he's the one who this week was outside doing almost like his own therapy and playing in the sand and building a little fort and putting a flag on it and then saying, and I was praying, Mom. And I said, you were? And we're not necessarily a huge organized religious family, but he says, I was praying. And he said, I was praying to God because he must feel really bad right now. And God must be really sad. So I have a little boy who's 6 years old who is beyond his anxiety really now, and he's worried about the higher power's ability to cope with the day-to-day stresses and his own sadness. So there's this huge variation within my family, and it's been a confusing time, not only for the kids but for me too, because I was actually amazed at all the feelings this brought up in myself. The recurrence of the Cuban Missile Crisis when I was a little girl, Vietnam when I was in high school and college, losing, friends to that conflict, and just the feelings and things that it brought up of my own is past, and yet wanting to be strong and helpful for my family and for my kids. So it's been an interesting and kind of unsettling 3 weeks or so within our home.
Unsettling for all of us, for sure.
Yeah.
Dr. Kramer, could you talk to us a bit, please, about what Julie has just described and how that fits clinically?
Sure. As you were talking, I thought to myself, your family is, in essence, really a nation in one home. You've really experienced everything that we're all going through, and particularly children, the whole gamut from it's something that's not an issue for someone all the way to its potential issue to reoccurring issues of unfinished business in our lives. So you've really touched all the mental health issues in some way, and so I'll try to go through some of those that you mentioned.
Thank you.
I think we have to remember that when children get traumatized, they really respond in many different ways. There is not one clear way that any child, or any adult for that matter, will respond to anything. Some children are pretty good. It just doesn't bother them. They're resilient to certain kinds of information or certain exposure to traumas, etc. The other end of the continuum is a child that down the road, maybe not initially, but down the road may actually develop a mental health disorder or problem. Usually that is around, like, for example, post-traumatic stress disorder, which I'll talk about a little bit longer. But there are many different kinds of reactions that when we go through a trauma, how we react, particularly children. I mentioned stress reactions like post-traumatic stress disorder. It's just one of many reactions. Some children just get general anxiety. They just get nervous. They may be looking up to the skies, as you mentioned, or they're sort of wondering what's going on. Other reactions, though, include children get depressed down the road. Instead of reacting to the stressor in terms of a trauma like we traditionally think, such as PTSD, they get depressed. They withdraw. They worry more, and that worrying leads to them isolating more, shutting down the system, not being as active as they usually are, not eating well, they lose their appetites and things of that nature. Other reactions may be just the opposite. Instead of shutting down like the depression, some kids will just do the opposite. They will actually act up. They get into trouble a little bit more. They get more verbal, or they get more aggressive. And so it's more acting out behavior. And that's how they're dealing with that internal anxiety and not knowing what's going on out there for them in the real world. For other kids, though, they develop physical problems. They get sick more, they got physical pains, they're not feeling well. It's just their way of trying to cope with something they don't know how to cope with. And you have to remember, we all as adults have years of experience. You mentioned that for you it brought back past issues.
Right.
For you, you've dealt with the Vietnam War, you've dealt with losses, you've dealt with the Cuban Missile Crisis. Through that, you've learned how to cope with certain kinds of traumas. So you're able to draw on those resources. Young kids, kids in high school, don't have those resources. They don't know how to deal with it. So they really look for others, sometimes to their peers, and sometimes, to their parents or their foster home or their foster family. So it's going to be very important in this time that families really come together, because the best work we can do is really going to be prevention in nature, educating our children about what's going on, being aware that our reaction may actually cause them to react differently. We sometimes refer to it as secondary trauma. In this case, it's the environment, how we react to the situation, tells a child how they do. A child who's not worried about it, as an adult, I say, boy, this child has to have a problem. It's bothering me, it's bothering the other kids. Why aren't you? Whether it's what happened in New York or whether it's an earlier trauma. And because of that, we'll want to talk more to that child, and we want to say, doesn't it bother you? Aren't you feeling this? How are you doing? And all of a sudden the child starts thinking, I should have something gone wrong here. Yeah. And so all of a sudden they'll start to do what they see the other kids who are having problems do, simply to maybe meet our own expectations. And all families do that, but it can happen, and we as foster parents or parents need to be aware that how we respond to something is how the child is going to learn to cope with that situation. It sounds like, my guess is you're doing some pretty good work there with the kids, and I have to admire you. 7 kids in the home, and you've dealt with really a trauma that has caused some children to be re-traumatized perhaps. In those kinds of situations, what parents need to be doing obviously is things like talking to their child. You mentioned, one of the child is sitting with someone watching TV. You may want to think about maybe limiting the kind of contact for that particular child, because you've got to put that information in context. So if you're watching a news broadcast or whatever about the trauma, and right now there's a lot of that on TV, even though it has dropped off quite a bit, it's important that as the foster parents that you sit down with that child and talk to the child about their feelings. And your cues have to be how the child's responding. You can't give children more information than they're willing to take or deal with. And I guess you're probably doing that. But for other foster parents and parents out there, they should be sitting down and explaining what's going on. So if there's something the child doesn't understand, and put it in perspective. I mean, you have the towers, 2 towers that have been completely destroyed, another plane that's down, and then you're hearing about anthrax, and all of a sudden you hear in the news someone down in Florida has this.
Yeah.
So it's like one person means everyone's going to get it. Children think a lot differently than we do, and it's important to realize that. So a child processes things differently, not as we as adults. We can sort of more logically think about things. But for a child, the fact that it's been talked about and occurs once, I mean, I'm going to get it next. And if they hear the symptoms of a flu or a sneeze, some children will worry about that. So educating your child and putting it in perspective, making sure children feel safe. I mean, we're in a rural area. There's less likelihood for us to have a 747 drop in than it is in a major city like you mentioned in Seattle. So we need to reassure children what's going on. They are in safe environments and things of that nature. Most children and most people will have some sort of acute stress reaction to what has occurred or to any trauma. And what's important to remember is that is normal. I would expect a child to be doing some of the things that you mentioned, worrying if this is going to happen to me, wondering where you're at because they care about you. And it's important to let them know that we are safe. So reassurance is extremely important. The fact that they're not sleeping, that's probably normal. They'll make more out of it than you need to.
Okay.
However, if they're not sleeping, and it's 3 and 4 and 6 months down the road, then that's a whole different story. Sense of loss, sense of grief, shock, anger, these are all normal things, and the child needs to know what I'm experiencing is normal, and that's healthy. What we want to watch out for down the road, let's say in 2 and 3 or 4 months, is the child who's staying up all night or waking up numerous times a night, for example, or a child who all of a sudden is avoiding situations that remind them of the trauma. For example, you take your children to Seattle and there's a big tower, and all of a sudden they don't want to go anywhere near it. Or children that are having recurrent nightmares for several months in a row around the trauma, or undue anxiety about your safety. If that continues for repetitively down the road, then you need to be thinking of what's going on and talking to a professional or getting advice. It may not mean necessarily that you have to go and seek professional help, but you may want to call your local mental health center and say, this is going on, what do you think? Do you think it's worth coming in and talking about it? We may just simply provide you educational material. There are a lot of support groups that are out there that are also useful for parents and children that you can take the kids to. Or we may say, yeah, it sounds like it's now beginning to be a problem. Let's talk about that. Okay.
Thank you. We're here today not only to talk about our children in care, but children in general. But specifically, we know that the children in our care within the Department of Social and Health Services come to us having been traumatized prior to their admission to our system. And Ross, would you please talk about the department's commitment to addressing this issue and what all of us in the field can do to help with the effort?
Well, I think the first thing that we need to do is be sensitive to the fact that the children that come into foster care particularly may be more vulnerable than other children to have reactions to traumatic events, tragedies like September the 11th, than maybe other children do. And at the same time, I think we need to be sensitive to the fact that foster parents like Julie are really the primary kind of person to help them through these kinds of events and to resolve their anxieties and their fears that come up. And I was just listening to you, Julie, about how well you seem to be doing that with such a variety of children. It warmed my heart a great deal. Why I think our children are more vulnerable to these kind of events, even though there are differences amongst children, is because the children that we have in foster care, by and large, face a whole bunch more uncertainties in life than other children. They're uncertain about their past. What was happening in their families. They try to make sense out of the families they came from. They're uncertain about maybe why they had to come into foster care. What were the reasons? Was it because of me? Was it because of somebody else? They're uncertain about their present because they're wondering about who's in charge of my life. How long will I live here? They're uncertain about the future because the future is, well, where am I going to live? Who is going to be the person for me forever? And they're sometimes uncertain about themselves in the sense that, did I come into care because I was bad, because I'm not lovable? So this greater sense of uncertainty creates more vulnerability. And the second reason I think they're more vulnerable is because for some of our children, they're more unconnected than other children. They're unconnected to their families of origin. They might be unconnected to their relatives or their friends. And so when you have children that are more unconnected, who have more uncertainty, I think their view of the world, generally speaking, changes. Their view of the world is one in which it's kind of a lonely, scary place. It's the view of the world where unpredictable things are going to happen, and bad things are going to happen to you. And if they haven't happened to you, then maybe they're lurking around the corner waiting to happen to you. And so when we have events like this, I think it confirms for some of our children that worldview that they have, that bad things will happen to them, and awakens all of those uncertainties. But I think there are at least 4 things that our foster parents can do, and you did them all in my mind, I was counting them here, that can help children in general. And the first one is that in these moments of crisis, we have to find a way to be with them to do with them more. We have to be present more in their lives, whether it's watching television with them, whether it's just being around them, or whether it's doing things with them. And I was thinking of the stationing of the National Guard at airports. I was thinking about that, this gives a sense of security and comfort to people traveling, that if something bad happens, there will be some protective person that will know what to do and will help me. Well, I think sometimes for children, just being there in that sort of caring, nurturing, protective capacity helps. And I listen to you being there more for your children. And the second thing, I think, is trying to increase predictability, trying to increase the predictability of their routines, when we have dinner, what the family events are, to try to build that in so that for them there's the sense that while there is chaos and unpredictability out here, there is at least some predictability and guarantee of things in the place that's important where I live. The third thing I think we can do, and again I heard you doing this so wonderfully, Julie, is trying to help our children talk this out. And that's different than trying to talk them out of it. Because sometimes when children talk about their deep anxieties and emotions, we want to take the pain away too quickly, or we want to say, well, it'll be better in the morning. That's not our job, to talk them out of their feelings, but it's to get them to talk about it, to look at it, to explore it, and begin to resolve it. And I think maybe the last thing that we might be able to do for our children in general is trying gently to change their worldview by things like, aren't you glad that we live in a safe neighborhood here? Aren't you glad that this is a safe house? So that somehow their view of this unsafe, unpredictable world gets changed by the way we speak to them. And I think most of our foster parents do that naturally and don't know it. But that's the kind of thing that more than professionals sometimes can really get them on with their lives.
Thank you, Russ. I think those are really valuable comments. I think when you reference domestic violence, so many of our children that are in care have experienced domestic violence in their home. And this event on the 11th of September was really, the family of man having domestic violence. And so, I do think that there's a real need for us to work with our kids around the fact that not everyone is out to hurt you, that the shoe isn't always ready to drop, although right now we all somewhat feel like that this is not their fault, and that there is the possibility of a brighter future. And for us that touch the lives of these children in foster homes and within the department, within the judiciary, anybody that is dealing with these children, I think needs to keep in mind that this is a reiteration of the violence that they have seen so frequently in their home, that unpredictability of never knowing when it's going to happen, and how to protect yourself when it's happening in a maelstrom around you. We have some questions that have come in from the field and from our foster parents in the audience. We're really pleased to have our foster parents in the audience this morning, and thank you for making time to enhance your skills. And we want to thank you folks out in the field as well that are joining us by webcast for taking the time and having the ambition to improve your skills so that you can have a greater impact positively on the kids. The first question that we have is one from a social worker in Region 2 in Wenatchee. How can professional helpers, social workers, and foster parents help children who have experienced trauma, help them to maximize their own resources, build on their strengths, and avoid inhibiting their own grieving process? Do you have any thoughts on that, Dr. Kramer?
I think everyone needs to pitch in. There's a role for everybody, and sometimes you have to remember there are a lot of resources, out there. I can speak in terms of like mental health. If you have any concerns or questions about your child in terms of whether there's normal development or related to dealing with a prior trauma in their life, or what's currently going on in terms of the trauma we're experiencing in our nation today, you can call your local mental health center. We have a lot of information and brochures or books we might be able to recommend in terms of that may be helpful to read to the child or how to talk to the child and things of that nature. And we want to be there for you. And you can find that by looking in your phone book under mental health, under counseling or psychologist, and look for your local mental health center. There's also private therapists sometimes in the communities that also specialize in these areas. And mental health actually has a variety of resources within itself. We have also social workers, master social workers. We have psychologists, licensed therapists, and case managers. We can even outreach into the home to help support you if that is needed. So that is clearly a resource that I would urge you to use, or anyone out there, is by calling that. Other resources in terms of dealing with trauma is also, we have, across the whole state, we have what's called domestic violence and sexual assault advocates that are out there. You'll find this in every single county. These are people that volunteer to work with both adults or children who have been traumatized around domestic violence and sexual abuse. And those are two large stressors and events and traumatic events that occur with a lot of kids who are in foster care. And we need to be able to address that. And that's often a free service that's available to them. They provide support, like in our county, we provide support groups for either children or adults who have experienced that through those particular programs. And there's also volunteer support groups out there where families can get together to talk about how to deal with their children, or even support groups for children themselves. And again, if there's an indication that this event is continuing to affect the child, whether it's an early trauma or a recent trauma, please call and ask the question. There's nothing wrong with that, and we encourage everyone to go ahead and do that. So then we can let you know, hey, what you're doing is keep on doing it. That's what you need to be doing. Being a parent, being there for the child, loving the child, listening to the child, and tell you what things, pitfalls to avoid. It's some of the things we want to do with any child that's been traumatized recently, is just what you mentioned. Keep to normal routines, because there's already a lot of change going out there. I think what you mentioned, the sense of security with the police out there, and law enforcement and the National Guard. But it also can have an opposite effect for a child, because a child is not used to seeing all those things out there. And for them, that's sort of like, what's going on? Things are different in this world. And we may say that that's safe, but if the child says, something's not right here, we need to help that child understand what's going on.
There's sort of a balance to me about how quickly we move children to the professional helping network versus how much we can depend on parents and foster parents to do some of that work. Because I think if we're not secure ourselves about the events, if we're still doing our own resolution, then we tend to push them more into professional help that they may not need. So I wonder if you face that, Julie, and then what you think, Doctor, about that balance.
I think you talked about it. It raised your own issues. Yeah. And my guess is those events have been pretty settled for you over the years.
Oh, I thought they were,
right.
Yeah.
And so the child doesn't understand that you have your own issues. And that's something, depending on the age of the child, you have to really pay attention. Are we dealing with a 5-year-old versus a 15-year-old? You're going to talk to them differently.
Right.
For the 15-year-old, you may actually share some of that information. Right. What you're seeing going on in me, it's not just what's happening out here, it reminded me of these old things. Which also tells the child, if I'm getting anxious now, maybe I can talk about what happened, my original trauma. So that can be a very good experience. With a 5 or 6-year-old, 12-year-old, 6-year-old, they're not going to understand that as much. So you'll have to talk to them, I think, a lot different. But I agree with you is prevention is very important at this stage for any child that's been traumatized, and not to pathologize it also. There are plenty of kids out there who do have mental health disorders that we need to deal with. But doing what you're doing and what you suggested are the things we want to do up front before we speak out. Let's get them to a therapist for the next 6 months or a year, because we may actually create more of a problem. And it is a very delicate balance, and I hear it all the time. I think maybe you've experienced it if you call mental health, and you say, well, my child's doing this and this, and we say, well, that sounds pretty normal, or that's understandable. It's like, they don't get us. Yeah. So we're trying to figure out what information to give for that situation. But from someone else's world who's dealing with a child who's not sleeping, it's like, help me right now.
Yeah. After 7, 8 nights in a row of being woke up every 45 minutes, maybe other people can still say, well, that is normal, they'll work their way through it. But, at that 10th time, at 4:30 in the morning, you're pretty doggone tired.
Oh, absolutely. And one of our advice might be, and I've had this situation where parents have come, and I think other therapists have had this, my child won't sleep. They get up out of bed, and I put them back to bed, and then they get up, and I talk to them, I put them back to bed, and the parent will come and say, it's a real problem, and it is a problem. I'm not the one that's getting up every night, you are. And the advice may be as simple as, well, hey, should we listen to what's going on, and the advice that comes back might be is, well, when the child gets up, put him back to bed, stay with him for 3 minutes and leave. But that's exactly what I've been doing. How many times do you want me to do it? And sometimes the answer is one more time, and the child is willing to get up.
Right.
But it's sometimes just doing things over and over for the child gets into that routine. Again, if it's more serious problems, then we need to be talking about that professionally at this time.
And I would like actually to talk about a couple of comments. Number one, I'd really like to thank you for the validation that, you know, you do see us as foster parents as being, number one, part of the team, but also that, you know, we do have some experience at being able to help our children and to support our children and work our way through it. And I really do appreciate hearing that as a foster parent from somebody within the DSHS system, right? You know, and I wanted to tell you that. Thank you very much. I appreciate that. And then the other piece I had wanted to comment too was, I'm also really glad to hear that it's okay for some of my children to be, whether it be that they're resilient enough to not be falling to pieces over something like this, or that, you know, just that all children are different. So that on one hand, it was nice to know that I shouldn't, or I don't need to be addressing this with Michael every night at the dinner table. Well, so now, how are you feeling about this truly, Michael, when he really would rather be outside playing basketball? That it's okay for me to let him outside to play basketball.
Go out and play with him.
Exactly, yeah.
Give him the opportunity to do it, and then he can talk to you then.
Right. So, you know, I do appreciate, actually, from both of you, your comments.
If I could just add to that, as to why I think that's important, Julie, is that for children to get on with their lives, they need to have confidence in the primary caregiver's ability to do that for them, to have some security that they can help them find their way, that they can see them through this. And I don't know how you do that if we don't have confidence that you can do it. And I see it that way because of what it means for the child. That if we have confidence, we resource you to do that, then I know that child will have a better experience because the person they see every day will have the confidence to meet their needs.
And I also think that we as professionals need to do a lot better job of being there for you. You know, and I think that in mental health, as well as other agencies, you know, people come to us as the experts, but you're the one that knows the child. You're the one that can explain what's going on and know the differences in patterns. We help put that together maybe in a different way and make advice and suggestions and provide, you know, clinical interventions around that.
What I hear from foster parents is they like that 24/7 though.
It is, you know, and sometimes there's only so much, you know, we can do, and there's a lot of pressure and a lot of expectations of foster parents. You know, and the fact is, you know, foster parents are really working hard. It takes a tremendous amount of commitment to have children in your home that are not yours, integrating them with your own families, dealing with their special needs. You know, and some of your children have some special needs, and we need to take those into account. As a matter of fact, as we're talking about dealing with trauma, the other thing I'd like on a side mention is we also need to be aware in dealing with the children around their own ethnic and cultural needs. Right. Because in our homes today, you know, we have a lot of different mixed groups together. So you may have a child who may be Hispanic, or another child who may be Native American, another child who may have developmentally delayed problems, and all of them see things differently because of those cultural, ethnic issues or their special needs. And you have to take that into consideration. We as a society are not very good at doing that sometimes, and to use their resources out there. You know, there are a lot of resources for Native Americans. We've got the Native Americans Child Line, and I know I heard that you do have them. And you can reach into that community to draw from to help support them. That may be more comforting to them than something I give as a professional advice if I'm thinking mainly from the large mainstream society in that area.
And actually, that does bring up, in connection with this first question, I mean, I may not know the specific titles of books that would be good resources, you know, for foster parents or for children, But I do know, not just in my home, but in talking to a lot of other foster parents in the last, couple of weeks out there in the community, that in some ways I think that we were proactive even before we even in our wildest dreams believed that anything like this would ever happen within our country. A lot of us as foster parents have already established that big sense of routine and structure and predictability and consistency. And I think that not only in my home but in other foster parents that I've talked to, they believe that that's helped their children and them work their way through some of these issues already. And then that, like, as far as the cultural pieces, I do see that with my children. Our children are all Native American, and one of the things that the kids actually asked for was almost like rituals, and we do and have done certain ceremonies with our children because of their cultural backgrounds. And that was a piece that I found some of my children actually asking, can we have a sweat lodge? Can we pray? Can we go out and light candles and sing a song? I mean, they wanted that kind of a ritual to be able to help them grieve, process, celebrate. I think that each of my kids had something different in mind. Some of it was they just plain wanted to honor the people that had made it through. I mean, and I was very impressed with my children that they had, that wide range of feelings.
Yeah, and they may want to honor it in the way their culture, ethnicity speaks to, which might be different the way we honor things. And that's very important to allow them to do that. You were talking about kids often have bad dreams. Within certain tribes of Native American cultures, having dream catchers is the thing you may want to get out for that child to put it up to catch those dreams, so they feel more safe.
Right.
But I like what you said about ritual, because I think when we face traumatic things or unsettling things, we sort of, all of us fall back on familiar, and rituals and routines become more enriched for us, whether they be secular or sacred. And I wonder if you would think of that, can that work for children that are non-Native American in terms of what rituals we can do for them around these sort of issues so that they feel that comfort that rituals bring?
And I do think that there are lots of different things, and I did see it, like I said, some of my children asked for a sweat lodge, but other ones of my children asked for the flag. They wanted to put the flag out on the garage. They wanted to do the Pledge of Allegiance at home, not just at school. They wanted to be part of that one 7 p.m. candle lighting ceremony that was kind of broadcast across the nation. And they wanted to light the candles, be outside, and sing God Bless America. I mean, so, whether they were Native American or Caucasian or Hispanic, I see those as rituals or as ways that they...
And what a great opportunity for a family to come together and do things as a family. And the fact that you can do that versus everyone does their own thing. I mean, you have through a national disaster or any traumatization in a family, an opportunity to come together closer. Spirituality is another aspect in rituals. In bringing that into the home, as you notice, there's been an increase in church attendance and prayers and things of those nature. These are things that we're used to. It doesn't matter what particular religion is. It's what makes that individual feel comfortable and what their spiritual beliefs are at that time, and they need to respect that, and that's great. Family activities also is a great time to do family activities, because that's also reassuring.
I noticed that you are a disaster responder, and I know that you're on call to head to New York City to lend your talents to support the folks that are suffering there right now. How can we turn this into a teachable moment for our kids vis-a-vis some of the hate crimes that we have seen going on around the nation? How can we help our kids understand how wrong that is and redirect energy to a more positive way? And also with the awareness that some of the children in care may be victimized by hate crimes because people assume they're of a group that is targeted.
Right. I think that's particularly important because there are groups that we've identified, that are doing this, and we adults do the same thing, but we sort of characterize things. The problem is we characterize something and then we just apply to everybody across. Everyone with dark hair is of that group, or everyone with brown eyes. So it's not only that particular group that becomes victimized, like Afghans who are here, who are naturalized citizens, or in green cards, who have nothing to do with this and really feel, or the faith, when we talk about the jihad or something of that nature, it's very important to help children understand people are different, the thing we want to do. And other kids who just even look like them in school get picked on. And we like to think of ourselves as a society that's open and we don't discriminate, but in fact, a lot of that still goes on. A lot of it is still under the table, and you're hearing about it more and more. Kids experiencing it, they don't come home and talk about it also. I have a child myself who's Korean, and I remember when she was young coming home and talking about things, and I finally got her to talk, and found out that's really going on in school. And that's not even related to what's going on now, so you can see the intensity of the situation may intensify those kinds of behaviors. The things that we can do, I think, right now are many things that we've talked about, and definitely those 4 things that you talked about. Routine for children, explaining to the child what is going on so they understand where it happened, how it happened, and where we're at, and that we can be safe. Giving the child the opportunity to talk to us not really means maybe spending time with the child more often. Each child is going to be different. One child, maybe you sit down at the dinner table, that's the thing to talk about. With the other child that you happen to mention, like to play basketball, maybe we take extra time to go play basketball. That gives the child the opportunity. And looking for cues that the child wants to talk about it. Some children just don't want to talk about it, but probably do need to talk about it. So make yourself available. Raising the issue every so often gives the child the opportunity or spending more time. Other things besides, like you say, keeping to routines are very important. Focus on the child's strength. Kids are resilient. Kids have a lot of strength. Rather than looking at all the things that are going wrong, think about what these child's strengths and emphasize those. Kids cope differently. So when a child asks for something that helps cope with it, putting the flag out or wanting a ritual, what a great idea. Make that child feel good that they're contributing and helping. And doing the flag or going to vigils will actually do that. Other things, listening is a big quality, and I can't overemphasize listening to the child. Not forcing the child to talk, but listening. How did you say it before? Our job is not to
help them get it out, but not take it away.
Exactly. And the biggest thing is let the child experience their emotions. That is very important. Children, due to a trauma, may experience grief. The trauma being loss of a parent that I'm no longer with, or loss of a brother or a sister. So they're going to go through a grief reaction of shock, denial, negotiation, and trying to deal with that emotion. So rather, don't suppress it. And I think of the gender issues. When I was younger, get over it. Be a man, and a lot of that stuff is still around it. Males are not allowed to express it. If they are, they're going to act out. And maybe recognize that all of a sudden the child's behavior changes. Maybe that's because that child does need to talk about that. Not in terms of they have a mental disorder, but in terms of they need to talk. And that could be done within the family first, and if not, to support groups, religious groups, or if it's more serious, to mental health centers or counselors.
We have a question from Region 4. That would be the King County area. What is the effect of trauma from multiple sources experienced within a very short time, i.e. abuse, neglect, witnessing domestic violence in the home, removal from the biological home, placement in foster care, an earthquake, and now this disaster?
Well, I do know that, specifically with Brandon, that the earthquake, and Brandon was placed with us directly at birth. So he didn't have the removal from, a biological family. He didn't suffer abuse and neglect. But when that earthquake hit in March, it was a time when unfortunately I was not home that day. I was training down in Vancouver, and he was waiting to get on the bus to go to kindergarten, and he'd never experienced anything like that before. And in his way of thinking about it, it was bad weather. That was what he thought it was. He thought it was this huge wind, and that was what made him, not be able to stand up straight in the house. So for the next 4 weeks or so, every night he wanted to know what the weather was going to be like the next day. Was it going to be really, really windy? Because then he wanted to make sure that Mommy was going to be home if it was going to be windy. And after about 4 weeks or so, that all kind of lessened, and but he did talk about bad dreams, and he did talk about dreaming about wind and all of that, but then it lessened. And then when this initial disaster hit, again, it was that, for him, the fear of where's Mom, where's Dad, where are my brothers and sisters, and you know, even though he's moving through his own anxiety and talking about God's sadness, he still wants, that's his kind of thing right now. Where are you today? What time are you going to be home? How are you getting there? And those are the questions that he's asking. And I think that it is more, there's more of it, or in more depth now maybe, than if we hadn't had the earthquake in March. It's kind of like, you know, two things on top of each other for Brandon.
Interesting. You know, I don't know how relevant that this is for children in care in Washington State, but I'm from New York City, and I have stood on those buildings many, many times. My children have stood on those buildings many times. And I know some of our audience are from away. And so how does that affect children when they've stood on a building or stood on a hill, and through a disaster or a natural occurrence, all of a sudden it's gone? What was there is no longer. What does that do in terms of a child's view of permanence in the future?
I think it depends partly on the age of the child, and also the attachment to something symbolic, like you mentioned from New York. I never think of the World Trade Towers as a symbol of power. You know, you've heard that on the news. And so for me, you know, a terrible catastrophe, the towers themselves had no meaning to me, the laws of life. But for a lot of people, it meant something. It's in my backyard, you know, and that figure is now gone. So it does impact people in a variety of different ways. And the younger the child, the issue of permanency is a big issue. Is it there and it's gone? For some kids, it's gone, and they don't think about it. For other kids, if it had meaning to them emotionally or otherwise, then they're going to have more questions, or they're going to be more concerned. They may be war memories, because if this is gone, are you going to be gone next? You know, the parent or something that's very, very important to me. Going a little back to your original question about multiple things, you know, the more traumas you have, you know, you become more vulnerable. For some people, they build such defense walls, they don't want to let anything through. And as a foster parent, you may have experienced, or you know, working in this field, seeing the kids that have walls, nothing gets through. Now, the kid looks normal, looks fine, you know, no, doesn't bother me. But it's behind that wall, things are building up which may come out years later. So the more you're exposed to a trauma or a loss or experiencing something that was permanent and now gone, the more likely that something's going to impact you down the road. So the earlier you deal with it, the better it is in a preventative fashion.
Russ, how do you see the department's role in facilitating any of what we've been talking about?
Well, I see the foster parents as the first line of prevention and support to children through this. So I think our job is to try to resource our foster parents so that they can do that work, and to be available when they have those gray cases where they're saying, is this so much non-sleeping that I need more help than I can give? And then we need to be able to be there to resource the next stage of the game as to how then we can get that professional help for that small number of children that might need it. But one of the difficult parts about dealing with some of these traumatic events, I think, whether you're a foster parent or professional, is, I mean, I remember in my own life that I became afraid of thunder and lightning because my parents were afraid of thunder and lightning. On the other hand, when my father shared certain emotions about certain traumatic things, I felt very reassured that I wasn't the only one having those things. And it's trying to find that balance between how much of our own reactions to things are good to share with children versus not. And I don't know if you either have opinions on that, but it seems to be an important thing that we struggle with about, do we let some of our stuff hang out because that's good for children, or no, we don't let some of that hang out as we work through it. What did you do?
I think I did it differently with each child, maybe. and I think some of it had to do with age. Theodore is 17, and I think that I felt more comfortable talking to him about Vietnam and that, because I know that he's actually studied some of that at school. It wasn't like this totally unknown entity or unknown past kind of historic experience. A couple of my other kids would have looked at me and said, Vietnam what? It would have been just beyond them. So I think that I made some choices based upon, number one, their age, and also whether or not they could actually verbalize, not only listen to what I was saying, but were they then going to be able to come back to me with questions or being able to, to share then how that felt, because some of my children I don't think would be able to necessarily do that, and then I would feel kind of like maybe I just dumped on them, so I think it was kind of a process, and I think my husband felt that, too. It was, Lynn's probably not quite as outgoing as I am in a lot of, verbally, and so he processes things much more quietly, whereas I have a tendency to kind of just get right out there and talk about it. We're a good partnership, I think, in some ways, where sometimes he'd tell me, Julie, you need to, back off there a little bit, and in other cases, I could say, well, Lynn, I really need to hear from you. I need some support from you. So I think that helped me a lot, just having a good partner in this.
That's an important ingredient.
All of those are important. When I work with families, I often say to have healthy societies, you got to have healthy families. To have healthy families, you have to have healthy marriages or adult relationships. And to have healthy marriages and adult relationships, you got to take care of yourself. And so by taking care of yourself and being self-aware, it goes up the chain a little bit. Because if you can take care of yourself, you can take care of your children a little bit better. If you can't, then you need to take care of yourself. And some foster parents may need the additional support so they can take care of their children more at the same time, or any parents for that matter.
And I did hear that, actually. A couple of foster parents called and asked me specifically, so are there things or are there resources that the department is going to be able to offer to me as a foster parent? Are there going to be resources that are going to help me get through this so that I can be there for the kids? And I guess that was a question I wasn't sure how to answer. I didn't know if there was, a website set up someplace for, foster parents to be able to get, a support group going, or if that's something that we should look at for working on in the future,
Because my sense is this won't be the last of tragedies, whether they be natural tragedies or terrorist-type tragedies. Will be other events that will happen, car accidents, there will be floods, there will be those things, and that may be a good thing that we could begin to plan for in preventative work.
We will have a list on the website of written material that you can access to help with issues that we've been talking about this morning. And after the break, when we come back, we will be joined by Judy Olmstead, who is a therapist and mediator, and who teaches a class on stress reduction. And she will actually be physically demonstrating with Julie some techniques that you can use in your home with your children to hopefully reduce stress and to center yourself so that you can address these issues and other everyday stressors in a more constructive fashion. And in bringing our time now to a close, I'm wondering if you have any last thoughts and comments, Ross, that you'd like to share with the audience in terms of where we go from here. How do we help our children see that the world still can be a loving place and that positive things can happen in their lives?
Well, I would like to say two things, and Judy, again, is my wonderful sort of mentor, role model on this. But one is, the bigger the event, the more we have to tune into our children in terms of observing, listening, and the second one is being with them more, just spending more time. And I thought your examples of whether it's more time in actually exploring it or just playing basketball and being there if they need to talk about it. But I think tuning in and being with them are the two most important things we can do.
Thank you. I think that we all want to let foster parents know how much their participation in what we do matters to us. As a social worker that's been kicking around the system since I don't know when, I can tell you that we could not do what we do without you. You are definitely the front line of what we do in the war against child abuse and neglect in this country. You are the people who will lead these children or lead them into adulthood, and you will be the ones that leave them with either a sweet or sour taste in their mouth for parenting and for sharing their lives and hearts with other people. So I want to say thank you to you. I know that our department leadership really appreciates everything that you do. Would you, in closing, like to kind of encapsulate what you'd like folks to take away from this session this morning?
Well, there's many different things, but sort of going on what you said is, be there for yourself and be there for your children right now. And do what comes normal as a parent. That is very helpful.
Julie, what would you say to your colleagues out there dealing with this issue today?
I guess basically to just support, you as individuals in getting what you need to. Oftentimes I think that as foster parents, we're always, we wouldn't be in this if we didn't want to nurture and we didn't want to take care of and we didn't want to help fix things. But I think that it's important, and I would really support the foster parents themselves in remembering what they need to do for themselves and getting the support that they need, whether it be advocating for support groups or other kinds of, other support systems that are out there. And it's not just in regards to a catastrophic kind of a trauma, but, we all suffer as foster parents too, separation and loss issues when our children go home or go on to other placements. And so these are ongoing issues for us too, and I would really support all foster parents in getting what we need to.
So reaching out to each other.
Yeah.
And if you are in a community that doesn't have a foster parent association, maybe working with the department around forming one.
Well, and just doing what we're doing here. I am so happy that this, we have this website now that we can we can archive these kinds of things on.
Right.
Trainings for people who live out in, OMAC and Republic and all these other little towns that, it would be difficult for them to get into a support group or get into a specific training. But because of the website and these types of training opportunities, we're more available to each other, I think.
Right, and it really is a huge human community that we're all a part of. And so for now, we'd like to say see you in a bit, because we will be back within the next half hour with a second part of our presentation that will be focusing on stress reduction. I want to thank the participants this morning for sharing their expertise and their care and concern. And want to encourage all of you to email us, and the email address is right there on the website, with your feedback, and we will issue certificates for this training. All you need to do is to ask through the email, and we will send a questionnaire and evaluation form to you that we'll ask you to fill out. So thank you for your time, and we hope to see you back here in a little bit. Thank you.
Good.